All right. I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm Diane Steepro at Jeffersonville Township Public Library. Actually, I'm in my basement because the library is closed due to the ice, but I ordinarily work at the library. And I have a few announcements before the program is Lift Every Voice, a celebration of American poetry. We're going to proceed with the program in just a few minutes. I'd like to let you know about a few things that are coming up here at the library, though. First, we here at Jeffersonville Township Public Library are wrapping up the creation of 2 online history tours. One deals with Black history in Clark County, including 2 largely forgotten civil rights battles. One of which is the subject of a book that is making quite a few headlines lately. Was featured in CNN this weekend, A Shot in the Moonlight by Ben Montgomery, about George Denning, who was the first African-American man to win a civil judgment of, it was $50,000 in 1899 against a mob that tried to lynch him. And he lived 30 years of his life in Jeffersonville, and also has some Louisville connections. So he was in Simpson County, Kentucky when he was attacked. And he and his family were attacked multiple times. So it's quite a story. This tour, which we've called the Clark County African American History Tour, and a tour of Orphans of Clark County, will be available at Discover Indiana Tours. Discover Indiana Tours can be found with a URL, Discover Indiana Tours. Also, it can be downloaded as an app to your phone. We also have been awarded a grant to create a program treatment and racism in our area from the time of the revolution to the present. First on African-American soldiers and their treatment after the revolution, especially land claims being purchased by rich white speculators, and move on to through history to up to the redlining and other discriminatory real estate practices that fuel a lot of inequality in our area today. That program will take place in late April. Please visit our website, library.org, for more information about our programs. And now I'd like to introduce the folks who are going to be presenting tonight. Oh, good. Our panelists tonight include our moderator, Dr. David Anderson, an African-American literature scholar who teaches at the University of Louisville. Frank X. Walker, an award-winning poet and author of the 2020 book, Black Man Masked. You know, give him a little ad here. This is what it looks like, but I imagine on your phones it's not looking very great. But I guess if I had sharing enabled, I would give you a slide of it. It's a nice looking book, and he's also the author of many other books, but that will be available at the library shortly. Jackie Nelson, a Louisville activist and English teacher. Also joining us tonight as readers are Maya Anderson and Jordan Crady, both students at the University of Louisville, and I will get somebody who Anderson, I'm going to mute myself.
Yes.
So.
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming today, and I want to thank both Professor Walker and Ms. Nelson for joining me, as well as Jordan Crady Anderson and Maya Anderson, who will be reading 2 of the poems this evening. The reason why we're gathered here today is partly well, it's both due to Diane Stepro writing for and getting a grant from Library of America, which is publishing an important new anthology of African-American poetry entitled African-American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song. And one of the things that is fairly important about this anthology, edited by Kevin Young, who is the literary editor of the New Yorker. He was at one time the director of the Schomburg Center as part of New York Public Library, and is now, I think, the new director of the Smithsonian Museum for African American Culture and History. And central to a lot of Kevin Young's own work, both with the public and his own writing, is a recovery of African American history, a recovery of voices and experiences. The anthology is partly, it was conceived because it's been a quarter of a millennium that there has been published African American poetry. It was in 1767 that Phyllis Wheatley, as a 13-year-old enslaved girl, published her first poem in the Newport Mercury, and ultimately became one of the leading poets of basically of the time of the American Revolution. And in a sense, African American poetry historically has had a kind of double burden. It has not only attempted to give voice to the Black experience and Black history, but often African American writers have been not only sort of exemplary members of the community, they've had to often speak on behalf of the community. They've often had to demonstrate what the entire community was capable of. And they've often played a role that was comparable to blues singers, to rap performers, to a whole line of people who often are of the people, live the life of the people, and speak on behalf of the people, not only to the people, but to broader communities. So in many ways, the conception of this particular anthology is a reminder of not only the long history of African American poetic accomplishment, but in many ways, the work that that poetry has done to often fill in historical blanks. Those of us who have, and I think many of us had school assignments of, write your family history. And, of course, and I won't speak for everybody, but, in my history, you hit a wall. And you become reminded of the erasure of people, the lack of documents, so much that is left to oral tradition, and so much that is basically left for people to imagine and to reconceive and to construct what was there. And that is one of the things that poets do. I mean, I'm not going to say they do this, that, and the other and tell them what to do. But one of the things that African American poets have consistently done is both recover history and embody memory. That is, often imagine or reconstruct what is missing or what is simply there in fragments. So that's one of the things that we'll be focusing on today. We will first be reading some poems and then briefly respond to those poems. And then there will be a short panel discussion afterwards, thinking about the particular roles of African American poetry in particular with respect to the community, with how it is imagined, what work it does, and in what directions it's going. So without further ado, I've talked too much. I'm going to first ask Jordan Crady Anderson to unmute herself. Hi, Jordan. She is one of my students and one of my top students at the University of Louisville. And she will be reading Langston Hughes's poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers.
I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.
Thank you very much, Jordan. I think Kevin Young probably chose this poem to lead off these kinds of programs for a variety of reasons. It's one of Hughes's most famous poems, and Hughes himself is one of the most famous of African-American writers. A leading member of the Harlem Renaissance, probably one of maybe only 2 or 3 writers of the Harlem Renaissance who happened to be able to extend a literary career for 4 decades. He wrote in almost every genre, every imaginable genre, from poetry, newspaper columns, a novel, 2 volumes of autobiography, and so on and so forth. But this particular poem, which is still one of his most famous, speaks to a couple of things. I'm very mindful of the ways in which it alludes to river valleys and river histories. Many of us here are either in Jeffersonville or in southern Indiana or in Louisville or the greater Louisville area along the Ohio River. And in that case, the Ohio River, Louisville itself was developed partly through the development of steamboat.
Deals on the food you love. The kind of deals that make you...
Can somebody please turn that down, the background? Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you very much. One of the things in addition that stands out about this particular poem, besides the idea that...
I am Hackerman.
Yeah, I think we're being Zoom bombed, I suspect. And so I'd appreciate it if that could be turned off. Thank you. I think that that's the sort of risk that we have. Yes, Zoom bomber, thank you very much. But anyway.
We just saying hi.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Besides that, you have not only the importance of the representation of the development of a culture. Langston Hughes, importantly, for a brief period of time, because he had allergies, so he couldn't keep working at it, was a research assistant to Carter G. Woodson, who created Negro History Week, which became Black History Month. And Woodson, who was a product of Berea College, devoted his life to both collecting, archiving, interpreting Black history and African history. And this is a particular poem that embodies that, not only in talking about a whole range of civilization, but in addition to that, the idea of the poem itself marks an accumulation of historical progress, historical growth, historical experience. And so Hughes in many ways was insisting that African Americans have contributed to or not African Americans, but people of African descent have contributed to a variety of civilizations throughout history. Where you find civilizations, you often find people of African descent. I didn't want to be the only one to talk. If other people want to chime in, you're not obligated to. But those are the things that stand out. Professor Walker?
Yeah, I'm glad that poem was kind of the opening
an anchor for this project, because for me as a poet, Langston Hughes was one of two African-American poets I was introduced to in high school. And unfortunately, only two. So I had no idea about this pantheon of literature I was inheriting. But Langston and Dunbar were enough to get me excited about poetry and the potential of my connection to it. What I love most about his Rivers poem is how it reaches back in history and connects us all the way to the continent. And for a lot of poets of my generation and younger, we've looked to that, not just that poem as an example of how to use our personal history and our family history and our cultural history as source material for poems, but to look at his example of his connecting the importance of history that, I imagine he didn't just inherit from Carter G. Woodson, that I'm sure as Carter's intern or a mentee, it was kind of ground into him. I mean, this is his teacher telling him this is important. And it shows up time and time again. And if you read Langston's work over decades, you see him writing about everything happening around him and reaching backwards historically and anchoring himself of, the nickname as the Poet Laureate of Harlem, or African-American people, or the Negro, whichever version you prefer. He earned legitimately because he never separated himself culturally from his work and his subjects and his people. And I think for me, that's always been a model of activity and example.
I did see Kelly DeTillo wrote, "Rivers and water in general is an essential part of life. It carries us both physically and mentally from where we are to where we want to go." And I think that's an excellent point. Oh, Jackie? Yes, please.
It's kind of ironic. Maybe it's just the English teacher in me and in Kelly, is that I was thinking along those same lines, is that, to share this poem with students, they would, I would ask them, what does this mean to you? Or they would ask me, what does it have to do with me? You have to make it relevant, have to make it approachable. And so I would ask the question, so what do the rivers represent for him? And what do rivers or something represent for you? In order to get them to make that connection, because when I read it, rivers represented eternal comfort, sustenance, and he mentions all of those things. And so I would definitely have to try to make some kind of connection with my students. What is the thing that you can connect with that provides all of that for you?
I think that's an excellent point in terms. When I first read Hughes, in fact, he seemed so direct. I was actually surprised to read a poem like that, and I wondered, what can I say about this? This was years ago. This is 30, 35 years ago. I was just, a poem that was, for me, very concrete. I grew up in St. Louis. So I know about rivers and river histories, but I'm also often mindful of the ways in which I wasn't aware of African-American history in St. Louis. And what I really liked about the poem was the ways in which rivers both are constantly changing, the saying that you don't see the same river twice. Mm-hmm. And yet, the more that rivers flow, the deeper they become, the richer they become, the silt that they carry with them, and so on and so forth. And it also alludes to the tradition of slavery, because it culminates, well, it doesn't really culminate with the experience of Abraham Lincoln, but the Ohio River flows all the way down to the Mississippi, all the way down to New Orleans, which was one of the leading slave ports of the world. centrally talking about all of this. African Americans have a central part in American history, American culture. It is their life and experience that is important. So I mean, I feel, I don't mean to monopolize. I tend to, you can tell I love to talk, but I did want to go ahead and possibly move to the second poem, if it's okay. So I'm going to ask Maya Anderson to unmute herself and go ahead, and she is going to read Gwendolyn Brooks's poem, Malcolm X.
Original, ragged, round, rich, robust, he had the hawkman's eyes. We gasped. We saw the maleness raking out and making guttural the air and pushing us to walls. And in a soft and fundamental hour, a sorcery devout and vertical beguiled the world. He opened us, who was a key, who was a man.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you very much, Maya. I think Kevin Young included Brooks's poem, Malcolm X, for a few reasons. And I'm just going to speculate. This is a commemorative poem. And there's a long tradition in African-American poetry of celebrating heroes and celebrating them as representatives of the best within a culture and trying to capture that. So in writing about Malcolm X, there's also an attempt to write about what is it that we see about ourselves that is possible, that is laudable, that is important in one way or another. And she does so in very interesting fashion. She starts out, these are, oh, by the way, this particular poem was dedicated to the poet and anthologist Dudley Randall, who was an active part of the Black Arts movement. And in fact, Gwendolyn Brooks, who really had started in the 30s and 40s. She's an important African-American modernist poet starting out in Chicago and poetry magazine workshops. And in fact, her early poems are really good modernist poems. I mean, they represent life in Southside Chicago. They are influenced not only by African-American vernacular traditions and poets such as Langston Hughes, but she's reading her T.S. Eliot. She's reading her Ezra Pound, and she's writing some very naughty and very experimental poems. This poem, Malcolm X, which is one of many poems by many Black poets about Malcolm X, and his connection to Black power, his imagining of Black liberation and the achievement of civil rights, is in many ways her contribution, one of many, to the Black arts movement, another leading Black arts and literary movement, the Harlem Renaissance being the first, but the Black arts movement being another. But the ways in which she uses language, original, ragged, round, rich, robust, and just adjectives to try to describe character, who he is, what he's about. She describes his masculinity, which is very interesting. He had the hawk man's eyes. We gasped. We saw the maleness raking out and making guttural the air and pushing us to walls. And so she's trying to find in a poetic way, in structurally and in language, a way of depicting, not only defining and shifting a definition of who was this man and why was he so important, but also to try to convey in the poem the impact on the community in one way or another. If I didn't know if others wanted to join or.
I love this poem about Malcolm X.
And I think one of the things, sorry, I have a cat. I think one of the things I love most about it is that it's raw. It is, you just get this visceral, emotional reaction reading Brooks' description. And it just is so incredibly powerful. But then to use Malcolm X as this key that opens this secret place inside all of us, longing to release the truth. It's just a beautiful poem, a beautiful poem.
I think that's, it is remarkable, and it's very stripped down, very direct. Kelly, thank you for posting it in the chat so people could see it as well. And if you look in the chat, I'm not forcing anybody to do so. Unlike other kinds of poems, visually, the lines are very short and they call attention. They emphasize because they're end stopped, and they're not monosyllabic words, but they very much, your eye stops, stops, stops. So there's this constant emphasis of importance. Professor Walker, please.
No, I was just going to add to that, the shape of the poem, if you back away from it, it's also sharp and it comes out at a point in the middle and then peels back. The thing I always remember most about Gwendolyn Brooks is a poem I think a lot of high schools use, Be Real Cool, or they used to when I was a younger person. And I always still, even though the language is dated in that poem, I've always used it as a model for how to, use a timestamp in the poem. You can look at the language and tell what period of time she's talking about just by the references that are used. And it's also a good poem for young people to learn and to memorize, if they're dealing with recitation. There are a lot of programs like that in schools now nationally. But obviously, I'm a Malcolm X fan. My name is Frank X. Walker. And on purpose, and part of my own personal development and coming into being as a political person was connected to learning who Malcolm X was and what he stood for, not just politically, but culturally, and how important that was for a lot of people around the country. But Gwendolyn Brooks, for me as a student of writing, the thing I remember most is that I lived in a small town, rural central Kentucky, and she introduced the city to me. I had never been to Chicago, but in her poems, you can go to Chicago because she looks out her window at alleys and she's talking about pool halls and these kids on the corner. And none of those things were part of my real world, but she brought them so much closer. And I always enjoyed having access to Chicago through her poems. Though she didn't limit her work to Chicago, it seemed to be grounded there, and she reached back to the South as well. But yeah, a very, very important, poet, I think belongs in, if you're gonna look at an expanded definition of the canon, and I think this is really what Kevin Young's book does, it explodes this notion of who can be in the canon with not just a handful of writers, but, just 250 of us in here. But Gwendolyn Brooks definitely belongs in that canon.
Yeah, Jackie, please.
One of the things that I, after reading this poem and I thought about the tone, I said, defiantly hopeful, in this hero, in this man. And that was it, and I think Rhonda made a pretty good point, or a real good point in the chat, if you want to mention that, David.
Let me unmute myself. Rhonda in chat wrote, the emphasis on man, instead of accepting the boy or less than designation that others in his time might accept for survival, is maybe aspirational. Some of my poets, some of my students just read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And that's an excellent point. And I was waiting for an opportunity to say hello to Rhonda. Rhonda is a former student of mine from, I won't say how long, it's more, I had hair back then. But Rhonda was a wonderful, wonderful student. And I still remember you. And I still remember the last time I saw Rhonda, which was at the Louisville Zoo. And I think it may have been my son who was with me, who is now in his early 20s and in Taiwan. So thank you, and thank you very much. And I did just want to say that Brooks was one of the poets wrestling in mid-century with how to depict the inner psychology of Black people. And because at that time, in 20s, 30s, and 40s, they were still kind of wrestling with how do you depict African Americans? How do you depict a culture? And Brooks really stood out because I think in drawing upon sort of interior monologues and other things, she depicts the rich inner life of African Americans. And she was able to depict, as Professor Walker said, the community of Chicago. Her first book is Songs of Bronzeville, or something comparable to that, Bronzeville being South Side Chicago. And what she does is she has innumerable individual portraits, each character a three-dimensional human being, but no one person has the burden of representing the entire group. But what you see when you line up these dozens of poems in a row, you begin to see an entire community, an entire range of people. And it is that humanity that she's insisting upon, as Rhonda says in the Malcolm X poem, A Street in Bronzeville. Yes, that's my wife, Karen Chandler, pitching in, cleaning up the messes that David Anderson makes. Thanks, Karen. What I'm going to go ahead and do, I think it's my turn to read, and I'm going to read one of Kevin Young's own poems, Money Road. And as you'll probably find out, he's referring to a couple of things. He refers primarily to Emmett Till and the death of Emmett Till in Mississippi, in Money, Mississippi, in 1955. He was sent down from Chicago to visit relatives in Mississippi. And it's not clear what happened, but he was accused of speaking inappropriately or whistling at a white woman, and there's even doubt about that. But what happened is he had taken out his relative's home in the middle of the night, beaten up, killed. I think a cotton gin fan was tied to his body, and he was thrown into the river. And he was dredged up, I think, or he was recovered 3 days later. And when his body was sent back to Chicago, his mother insisted upon an open casket and insisted that people see what had been done to her son. Then the woman who accused him make a deathbed confession that she lied. Yes. I think there was an interview just a few, I forget how long ago, in which she said, it was made up. He certainly didn't do all of that stuff. And she also alludes to Robert Johnson, the legendary bluesman from around that area in Greenwood, Mississippi, and that area. And the fact that we know so little about him. There were 2 recording sessions with 29 sides, which are still some of the finest blues ever recorded. And yet I don't think we know where he's buried. And he's more legend than something that is palpable to us in many ways. So Young is basically kind of dealing with historical erasure and testimony. Not sure she's dead. She did recant and had a book deal in the works. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to go ahead and read in my fashion, Money Road by Kevin Young, for John T. Edge. On the way to Money, Mississippi, we see little ghosts of snow falling faint as words while we try to find Robert Johnson's muddy maybe grave. Beside Little Zion, along the highway side, this stone keeps its offerings, bud and Louisiana hot sauce, the ground giving way beneath our feet. The blues always dance cheek to cheek with a church. Booker's Place, back in Greenwood, still standing, its long green bar, beautiful. Friendship Church, just a holler away. Shotgun, shotgun, shotgun. Rows of colored houses, as if the same can of bright stain might cover the sins of rotting wood, now mostly tar paper and graffiti holding McLaurin Street together. R.I.P. Bucci. The undead walk these streets, seeking something we take pictures of and soon flee. The hood of a car yawns open in awe. Men's heads peer in its lion's mouth, seeking their share. For sale, squash and snap beans. The midden of oyster shells behind Lusco's, the tiny O of a bullet hole in Booker's plate glass window. Even the Salvation Army thrift store closed, bars over every door. We're on our way again, away along the Money Road, past grand houses and porte cocheres set back from the lane, crossing the bridge to find markers of what's no more there. Even the underpass bears a name. It's all too grave. The fake sharecroppers' homes of Tallahatchie Flats rented out along the road, staged bottle trees chasing away nothing, the new outhouse whose crescent door foreign tourists pay extra for. Cotton planted in strict rows for show. A quiet snow globe of pain I want to shake. While the flakes fall like ash, we race the train to reach the place Emmett Till last whistled or smiled or did nothing. Money more a crossroads than the crossroads be. Its gnarled tree, the Bryant store facing the tracks, now turned the color of earth, tumbling down slow as the snow, white and insistent as the woman who sent word of that uppity boy, her men who yanked you out your uncle's home into the yard, into oblivion, into this store abutting the Money Gin Company, whose sign, worn away, now reads un or sin, I swear, whose giant gin fans, like those lashed and anchored to your beaten body, still turn. Shot, dumped, dredged, your face not even a mask, a marred, unspared, sightless stump. All your mother insists we must see to know what they did to my baby. The true Tallahatchie, twisting south, the Delta, death's second cousin, once removed. You down for only the summer to leave the stifling city where later you will be waked, displayed, defiant, a dark glass. There are things that cannot be seen, but must be. Buried, barely. This place no one can keep. Yet how to kill a ghost? The fog of our outdoor talk. We breathe, we grieve, we drink our tidy drinks. I think now winter will out. The snow bless and kiss this cursed earth, or is it cussed? I don't yet know. Let the cold keep still your bones. Well, sorry, I have to kind of recover from that. In many ways, one of the things that comes to mind, because I've spoken with people of the generation who were old enough to remember Emmett Till, or hearing of Emmett Till even when they were children, who had nightmares that what happened to Emmett Till might happen to them. And one thing that is central about this particular case, because I think it was in Jet magazine, it was the Johnson Publishing Company that published pictures of the open casket. And so the image of Emmett Till's body, though the Undertaker did what the Undertaker could, I mean, it's horrifying. It's terrifying. And in many ways, that insistence that this one young teenager not be erased really made what happened to Emmett Till really a key part of the civil rights movement. He became a martyr, and it was that insistence on remembering that is very important. The poem deals, and I'm talking too much, I'm going to stop, but the poem deals with a couple of things. On the one hand, the ways in which the community has tried to move away from this. You have, Money, Mississippi and Greenwood, Mississippi made their money off of cotton. Slavery and sharecropping and exploitation for generations. And there's this sense of the community trying to, put all of this behind and kind of deny it. And you even get the ersatz experience of these houses or developments like sharecroppers' cabins, whereas they've tried to let the past go. And there's a sense of the speaker going as a kind of pilgrimage to reenact, to remember, and to try to imagine. I'll stop there. And I welcome Jackie or Frank in terms of their feedback, or even members of the audience too, and their reactions.
Yeah, I don't mind saying a few words about this. This has always been an important poem to me for several reasons. Now, I know Kevin's work and I know this was hard for him because he tends to shy away from being, too political or writing anything that might be seen as having an activist slant. But a lot of people of this current generation, millennials and younger, they see, when they understand what happened to Emmett Till, they see for them, maybe the first Trayvon Martin, and then George Floyd. And then there's so many other names that just come forward in history. So you see a whole pantheon of teenage boys who have met similar fates, these kind of public or private lynchings, and it anchors them to their own history in a way that they had not been anchored before. It allows them to see that their experience, doesn't exist just in a vacuum, that is tied to, to American history even. I even have a poem called After Dinner in Money, Mississippi. And in that poem, it's two poems on the same page, but what the poem tries to do is describe what two different communities do after dinner in Money, Mississippi. And on one side of the page, it's basically the equivalent of a pecan pie recipe. And on the other side of the page, it's the details of Emmett Till's murder. But both of those poems have a spine that is combined from words that are used on both sides, which makes this kind of new hinged poem. But I think that subject matter is almost like a rites of passage. Most of the poets, and I know quite a few poets have decided how close or how far away they're going to write about the subject. I don't know that you can be a fan of history or understand American history and be a poet writing anytime since then and not have something that in some way has a connection to that story of Emmett Till, of abuse of Black bodies, of even if it's written yesterday about something that happened last month, you could find those connections. And I remember talking to a group of young people when I visited a high school, and I asked them about Emmett Till, and none of them had heard about him. And somebody mentioned that there was a rapper who made a reference to Emmett Till in a song, and he'd heard it there, but he didn't know what it meant or why the reference was there. And I urged them to, use their phones and do a little research, see what you find out. And they were stunned that they had not heard about him or didn't know. And one of them even talked about, well, that sounds like this other death, from 10 years ago. And I love it when those connections happen for young people, where they make them on their own, because all that history is important. And what you said, Dave, at the very beginning about how poets over the years have taken this responsibility to be this recorder or conscious of their community and record what was happening. It's almost out of this African griot tradition, accepting that large responsibility. I think it's true, but it's a heavy responsibility if you really embrace it. It's easier to write beautiful poems about trees and flowers. There's no risk there, But if you're going to write about these kind of horrors, you really open yourself up to being vulnerable, to experiencing, the pain brand new for you by recalling that horror. And then every time you read that poem publicly or privately, you almost experience it again and again. So, and this was, to circle back around, I think it was really bold and brave of Kevin to take on this poem and let this be the poem that represents him in this collection.
Jackie?
There was just a couple things that I made note of in reading this. One of the things is that you could change Money Road to Clay Street in the East End, walk through and make that same connection. And instead of Till and Johnson linking the pain of the past, you can say a number of people's names, who were killed in the East End. But to me, I thought about linking the pain of the past to the pain of the everydayness of racism. And one of my favorite sentences in the poem is, "A quiet snow globe of pain I want to shake." And then I thought, it's calm and beautiful when it goes undisturbed, but it's more beautiful when it's shaken and disturbed.
That's wonderful. Rhonda agreed. I did want several people had really good comments. Ms. Best wrote, "The landscape seems to reflect the accursedness of that dastardly deed. And Karen Chandler mentioned that, as Professor Walker had mentioned, the subject matter is a kind of rite of passage. She mentions James Emanuel, Gwendolyn Brooks, Jericho Brown, Marilyn Nelson. Many others also have written poems inspired by Emmett Till. It's a very powerful poem. I did want to ask, and I did invite, but I don't want either of you to feel obligated, or for both Ms. Nelson and Professor Walker, if they had a poem that they would care to read.
I do have one, but it's very different. The tone is very different than what we've read here. So when I think about history and memory, I think about how strong we are as a people. And I think about how strong my mother was. And I think about how she gave me the history and memory of her love for cooking. And the poem that I chose, it just brings me joy when I read it. And it's a poem by Angela Jackson. And it kind of conjures up for me this sense of home and the past and the present, and the value of that I place on the moments of sharing the secrets that she never wrote down. Because when she taught me how to cook, there were no recipes involved. It was just that oral history that she shared. So this poem is called Greens. This is the kind of love you write home about. In sunlight, the single aunt sits around the harsh wood table and sighs. You know how strong the smell of mustard greens is, and bitter the turnip. Spinach, on the other hand, goes down easy. All this cooking in her one pot. When you write home, the kind of love it is.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank
So
you
it's
so
just
much.
kind of lighthearted, and I just thought of my mom. She recently passed, and so all things I see her, and so that just brought back that history and that memory for me.
Well, there's a tradition of there's kind of a new field in academia, foodways.
Mm-hmm.
The studying, and of course there've been a lot of cookbooks over the last 10, 20 years, really recovering African-American cooking traditions and cooking histories. And when I heard you read that poem, it very much reminded me of that. And of course, the smells, but also the traditions and the sense of family and connection. Very much so.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Walker?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if we were limited to a poem from the collection or not. So I hadn't chosen anything, but I'm going to pretend it was not limited to the anthology.
It is not limited.
I'll read a poem from my new book, since somebody mentioned it earlier in the introduction. And I think it also connects to this historical thing that I've referenced about looking backwards in time and paying homage to this literary heritage that we come from, because the poem is actually connected to a Paul Laurence Dunbar poem called We Wear the Mask. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that poem and heard it before. The poem I wrote is called Mask Man Black, and it's written about the pandemic, and being in the heart of it, and what it meant for me personally when it was time to have a mask on in public all the time. So it's a short poem called Mask Man Black. Black male me walks into a store in broad daylight, black phone in hand, wearing a black mask. You already know how this ends. Somebody felt threatened, somebody got shot. Black women wailing make the news, but it isn't new. All the chalk outlines are white. All the states are red. The coronavirus doesn't discriminate. Racists still do. Peel off mask. No grins, no lies.
Mm.
It's wonderful.
And for me, that it connects me to Paul Laurence Dunbar. It connects me to what's happening right now on the ground. It connects me to what happens when people see me, a grown adult grandfather with degrees and property, but with a mask on in the store, they still have this response that says, I'm a threat. And they are in danger in that moment. And to see it on people's face and in their bodies, I just remember how that felt. Walking in that store and seeing people respond to that. We weren't, now everybody wears a mask everywhere, it seems. But in that moment, people were just starting to wear masks. And to watch people look at me in that way and wonder, that first response was like, should I feel, and it's daytime, it's daylight, but I have a mask on, I'm a Black man, and they're responding to something that feels like it's ingrained in living in this part of the country. I don't know, or it's part of the insidiousness of racism in America, what that feels like and how we wear it on our bodies and how people respond to it almost unconsciously. And maybe they didn't know they were doing it, but I could see it every time it happened. And it moved me to want to write that particular poem.
One of the things I did that you mentioned, Paul Laurence Dunbar, is I had my students, in an after-school program, instead of writing a poem entitled "We Wear the Mask," they wrote one, "We No Longer Wear the Mask," and it was so powerful, absolutely powerful.
So they wrote it as a group poem?
No, they were individual ones.
Okay.
And some of them mirrored the poem and wrote their version of "We Wear the Mask" and not being who they really are. And I would have loved it to be as a 2-voice poem, but we didn't quite get that far, but it was definitely powerful.
Oh, that's wonderful. That sounds like a wonderful activity. What age group? Was it freshmen in high school?
Yes, these are all high school freshmen. I have one 10th grader.
Okay. And that sounds like a wonderful way to introduce them to writing, and also to introduce them to a literary tradition. One of the things that we're transitioning to, and I mean, both the poem and this discussion kind of lead to it, is, and I think Kevin Young wants us, the ghost of Kevin Young is watching over us even as we speak. He wanted us to think about these issues of history and memory, which is kind of the theme tonight. They aren't the only subjects, obviously, in African-American literature, but they do come up over and over. The idea often of confronting history, of often a traumatic history, as we've seen, as in Money Road, or a scary history or experience, but also the gaps in our history that a lot of poetry, a lot of African-American literature not only reconstructs, but advertises that it's reconstructing. Shows the process by which, we're at least trying to imagine what was possible, calling attention both to absence and erasure, but the very conscious work that we're doing in the present. So, I'm terrible at posing questions, but I am interested in both of your opinions, and then I think the audience can certainly chime in and participate too, in terms of how you envision the ways in which Black poetry deals with history, or the way, or the work of poets, groups of poets, such as the Affrilachian poets, of constructing perhaps, or making visible a regional presence, a regional history, a tradition, creating voices as imagining, for instance, York in two of your books. The enslaved person from Louisville, who accompanied Lewis and Clark, but was a crucial part of those expeditions out west. But the need, since he obviously couldn't leave documents behind, of imagining who York was, how he perceived things in real time, and what we're supposed to take away from that in connection to our own lives. So I guess I would kind of pose this won't lead any specific place, but how you envision.
Yeah, I'm gonna assume that question is for me. But thank you for that. When I saw that in the outline, I admit I got excited because it gives me the opportunity to talk about what I consider a basic formula to write any kind of historical poetry. It isn't officially a category in libraries, hint, hint, or bookstores yet, but there's so much historical poetry being written. Amazon just gifted me, after rating my credit card, with 2 of one about Phyllis Wheatley. It's a thick book, about 1.5 inches thick, by Honoré Fanon Jeffers, and it's full of persona poems that kind of fill out the life of Phyllis Wheatley and what it was like to be here and interact with people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, and to be this enslaved girl who was writing poetry, traveling, and getting published in a period of time when people thought that was intellectually impossible for a person of color. But for me, it's history and imagination is not enough by itself to make those things work on the page. The research is what drives it. And I think that's the part of it that for a lot of young poets, they may shy away from writing historical poems because they don't know enough about the subject or they know so little. But my graduate students, I command them to do that, to go to the library, to get to know what's in archives, to do some research on the historical subject they're interested in, and find something very brand new that shocks them or moves them in some way that hopefully will inspire them to do the work to be able to write those brand new poems and tell those stories. But there are so many books being written, and I think what drives them and the interest in them is that they are often narratives that have been undertold or muted. When you consider even York and Lewis and Clark, the way I learned about Lewis and Clark in high school and middle school is that it was just Lewis and Clark, two white supermen who did all this by themselves over a period of 3 years. But to find out from research that there were 42 people, who included a 15-year-old Native American girl and her 3-month-old daughter, and this African-American man from Louisville, Kentucky, just shook me to my core to wonder why I had never heard about them, or why I'd heard it told in such a simplistic way that kind of overinflated the contributions of two men and almost disappeared everybody else's contributions. So that drove me initially to want to write that first book. And then I was criticized because I told what I imagined was York's version, but I left out York's wife's story, and I left out Native American's story. And I thought, was that my responsibility? After traveling to the Nez Perce Reservation 3 times out west in Idaho, and meeting the tribe that figured so prominently in the success of the expedition, they gave me a copy of their oral histories that had been transcribed. And they had copies of the first book. And they asked me to do something with their oral history because they felt like the American version of the Lewis and Clark story left them out, that they were just footnotes or furniture or insignificant somehow. So I ended up writing a second book that tried to weave the women in and weave Native American history and story and importance in. And I felt better, and it was a thicker book because there were more voices and more representation. There was even a voice that was a tribute to Langston Hughes. It was called "The Rivers Speak," to make that nice and round. But I think that, I would recommend trying to find those books. And what it does in the classroom is it bridges disciplines. You get history classes, civics classes, English classes, language arts classes, all reading the same thing and having these long extended conversations about them because of the way that book is built and those kinds of books are built. So I'll stop there because I could go on I could do an hour lecture about that, but I won't.
But thank you. I mean, that's wonderful. And yes, I was setting you up with the question. Thank you so much. Jackie?
One of the things I think about with poetry and history, a lot of students say that they don't like it because they don't know the references. But it's an opportunity to do that research, to be able to make those connections. And that's just the hard part, is getting them to want to know instead of just brushing past it. But it's a process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I do want to invite people. Perhaps maybe the best way is if you type something into chat. If you want to ask a question or participate, and I can be responsible for reading it. I did want to follow up. Rhonda Nett writes, it's not York, but my students have responded to what kills me. What kills me's anguished call to hold on to, honor the contributions of those who have gone before. And I think that's an excellent point. I did want to ask both Jackie and Frank, if I may call you that, in terms of how you teach your students and how you cultivate their voices. There's a sense not only in which you help people understand the past, but in many ways give them tools of expression, empower them to find their own voices. How is it what roles do you play in terms of, maybe not necessarily poetry, but possibly but other kinds of writing, getting people to find their voice, their subject matter, develop that voice?
I think a lot of, especially the freshmen, they don't have a lot of confidence in themselves, that their stories matter. So I think it's important to let them know that their experience matter, it's real, it's important, it's necessary. And that if all of those people who had a voice, if they never spoke, then we wouldn't be able to connect with that. We wouldn't be able to know that I'm not the only one dealing with what I've dealt with. So I think it's important to try to instill confidence in them so that they also having a safe place for them to be able to share their voice, to be able to write, be able to speak. It's all about that confidence and knowing who they are and that they are valuable. That has been my experience.
Yeah, I co-sign that. I think that I'm always surprised to get college students who call themselves poets, who want to write, but they've never read a whole book of poetry. Or they don't own any. They were introduced to anthologies in high school. They were great writers, great grammarians, but the part about writing that leads to voice, in my opinion, is, I think hearing your own voice or knowing that you have a voice is really a listening exercise. And it only happens after reading. No matter where I go and they ask questions, one of the answers is always, well, you have to read. You have to know what else has been written. You have to find something that speaks to your own personal experience. That'll give you confidence. That'll make you feel included. I think if you introduce young people to poetry via a Shakespearean sonnet, you might lose some of them. They may feel disconnected or even punished because the language is so far away from them. But if you introduce them through a poem from Gwendolyn Brooks, they may feel closer because the language is familiar. They may feel close because it's a woman. They may feel closer because the experience is similar to their own experience. So you didn't lose them with that initial introduction. So I think that's always important to consider, those students. And it's also a great way to introduce them to people who are not like them, so they can figure out what they have in common. So I think one of my challenges and one that I give to grad students is, they have to give an oral presentation on a poet who looks, and these are writers who feel like they're good already. They're grad students chasing creative writing as a degree. But I ask them to talk about a writer who doesn't look like them, who's also a different gender. And it's then they realize that most of who they've been collecting looks like them, is writing things that they might want to write, but it's so close to their experience that it's never been really a challenge for them. And they come back and they give these presentations and they are always so moved to have discovered, this new poet that had always been out there, but they didn't reach for because they felt like they were outside their personal experience. And I love to see that happen in the classroom, and it makes them better writers. And also I think fine tunes their ear. And I think it's harder for probably a high school freshman to understand that they have a voice yet. They haven't lived enough. I met a high school sophomore in an interview for Government School for the Arts, who talked about having written her memoir already at 15 years old. And I'm thinking, wow, what must your life have been like that is already worthy of a whole book length?
But you would be surprised.
And she talked about, her life, and I was like, okay, I can see that. I said, but wait till you're 25 and then 35 and then 45 and 55 and 65. You have so much more. So there's a reason why there aren't many memoirs on the bestsellers list written by 15-year-olds. But I think just getting them to read, that's so important. When I visit prisons, I can always tell which inmate has been reading. There's a look in their eye. You could tell that intellectual thing that they didn't have going in, that they maybe didn't even pursue because they hated school or disconnected from school, that with all this extra time, their brains are on fire now because it's all this stuff happening for them that never happened before. And you can see it in their eyes, and the energy is just bubbling. They can't wait to ask that first question. And it's never a question because it's just them having a chance to have a conversation about all this intellectual activity and the voices they're hearing. And it's amazing how important literacy is to those people in that situation and to middle school students and high school students. I think all that contributes into making them potential writers of their own. And if it's something they're looking for, into hearing their own voice and recognizing it on the page.
Jackie, did you have, I just noticed you are muted, so I didn't know if you.
No. I was, there are some great comments in the chat.
Oh, yes, and I wanted to point those out. Rhonda from several minutes ago had mentioned in terms of writing and problems that students have concerning poetry and uncertainty. And she says, and students think that writing is about big events, not small events.
Mm-hmm.
Jenny Aberly, I'm pronouncing your name correctly, it says, and creating a safe space where they feel comfortable taking risks and sharing their work and stories is so important. And Elizabeth Best says, I've asked my students to interview their grandparents and parents about their lives in order to see their connection to recent history and write biographies about them. My hope is that they will be inspired to go beyond those recent histories to explore what lies beyond, but still affects the present. I tell them their grandparents are pages of history. And I think that's an excellent point. I did want to ask what, maybe because I don't want to keep going on, people are probably starving, but I did want to ask what might be your best poetic memory or memory of poetry that you have had or experienced, or something that really stood out? I did want to mention one thing, and it's that, yeah, long ago, I think my email, it chimes in the background. If you hear a little bell, sorry about that. When I was in grad school and I was writing some poetry, I never found my voice. I don't think poetry was my thing, though I enjoyed it. But I asked a professor, and this is at University of Pennsylvania, give me a book of poetry that can maybe help me think about subject matter and what I could write about. And he recommended a book by Marilyn Nelson. It was her third book, called The Homeplace. It's a wonderful book. It was nominated for the National Book Award, and it's a book about family histories. The first portion about the Atwood family in Western Kentucky. And the second half about her father's experience as a Tuskegee Airman. And one of the things that happened, and I loved the book, and I was just kind of reading it casually. And then my mother called out of the blue, and she said, you know, you've got this cousin who writes poetry, and, you know, she sent your father a book because your older uncle helped her with the family history, and I'm just going to send it to you. I said, oh yeah, great. It was the same book. And I realized I was distantly related to Marilyn Nelson, and I wrote her a fan letter, and you know, it was incredibly charming. And I didn't realize I was reading my own family history. And they said, oh, of course, Atwood, that's my grandmother's name, and that was the history. So, and it also, I mean, the idea that it could connect to family and depict family. And she told me things about my family I had no idea about, and humanized them in wonderful ways too. So that was my favorite experience with poetry.
That's a beautiful story. I love that. Marilyn is one of my favorite poets and people. She has a special program online last night that my wife and I tried to sign up for, but it had already sold out.
Oh, wow.
But think about, I guess, my favorite, or a memorable story I'll tell has more to do with my mother, who was the most creative person I ever knew. She's been gone 15 years, but she's still very present. She shows up in my work all the time. But I remember I thought I was a hot dog writer, and nobody could tell me anything. And I stopped on the way out of town one weekend and gave her a copy of my manuscript and just said, let's spend some time with this while I'm gone over the weekend. And I came back that Sunday afternoon and stopped by, and she was standing in the doorway, and she had the manuscript rolled up in her hand, and she unrolled it, and I could see the red marks on it. And she flipped through, and she had gone through it and marked up whole pages. And I'm thinking, oh, what? We're about to have a fight about this book and the lines. But ultimately, she said that she felt like there were poems in that collection that I was ready to publish, or I thought it was, that I could not publish, that I did not have permission. And there were poems in there that I could not publish until after she had died. And I was stunned. And it was the first time I'd been forced into a conversation where I had to realize that even though I felt like I owned the poems, the stories were not just mine. And I had some obligation to other people who lived on those pages, in those poems. And, I remember very cheerfully acknowledging that, she's my first editor. And I was a very young, ignorant poet then, very green. But I remember when the book came out, she was so moved by the contents. There was a theater production made from the book. And she came to every single production of every single night. And she sat there, and at the end, she was in tears. And I asked her, I apologized because I thought it was my fault that she was crying. I asked her why she was in tears. And she was just saying that some of the difficult things that were missing in the poems that she allowed me to write about, hearing them from other people's voices and seeing it on stage, made it feel like it was all worth it. So they weren't tears of pain. They were closer to tears of joy and relief. It's almost like this long journey she'd made in her life was just for that production in that moment for her. And so that's one of my favorite poem stories.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, Jackie, please.
My story, unfortunately, is rather sad.
Mm.
I have been out of high school for 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was in high school, I was never introduced to any African American poetry at all. And it wasn't until undergraduate school at U of L that I was actually introduced to poetry. And all of these light bulbs just came on, and I got so excited, and I just kept reading and reading. And then I started writing. I'm like, oh, wow, I can do this. And so I started my own little collection of poetry that I was so excited to be able to do this. I'm like, gosh, there are people out here who are doing this, who look like me. And, you know, and the rest is history, you know?
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I want to thank everybody. I don't want to keep you too long. I do not want you to die. I want you to eat something and have a good rest of the evening. But I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Frank X. Walker and Jackie Nelson. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually. I want to thank Jordan Anderson and Maya Anderson for reading. I want to thank my wife for supporting me, and all of you for joining us this evening. And I do want to, and Rhonda Nat, whom I do remember as a wonderful student. And one thing, next Thursday at 6 p.m., I will be joining the poet Mitchell Douglas. And this is also part of the Lift Every Voice grant. And he will be reading some of his poetry. And I will simply be following along and nodding and joining him in conversation. But please join us then as well. I don't know. And thank you to Diane Stepro, who did all of the hard work to make this grant possible, and Allison for helping with the technical issues. Thank you, everyone. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much.
Jackie, invite me to the last one.
We'll be sending out a link to this recording. I appreciate everybody for coming. You did all the thank yous I was going to do, so thank you for that. And thank you for your patience dealing with the interesting folks earlier on. I'm glad we got those issues ironed out.
Yes.
The link to next week's Zoom program is on our website calendar at jefflibrary.org. So we definitely encourage everybody to come back. Thank you guys again. This was a wonderful program, and everybody have a good night.
Take care.
What was?
I'm sorry, was there a question?